Okay, so my name is Tina Kanagaratnam. I'm a public relations consultant, and my husband and I also started an organization here called Historic Shanghai that focuses on Shanghai's history and heritage. And that's important because it comes into the lockdown story. So my last 2 months, I have to say that it was relatively speaking a soft lockdown. Our building was released on April 12th. So that means we were really only locked down for 11 days. And after that, we could, within the limits of being in your sub-district, come and go. Our building had no restrictions. So we could come and go. We had the privilege of seeing the city during these last 2 months of lockdown. Food was not an issue in terms of we very early on got food buys and government deliveries. Hunan Subdistrict had something like 20 deliveries over the 62 days of lockdown. So overall, it was a soft lockdown experience. But part of it, I think, is also perspective. Because of Historic Shanghai, because I study the history of the city, it was fascinating for me to watch Shanghai go through a historical moment. I was very conscious that we were living through this historic moment. Everything from how information was disseminated to how it was received on the ground to how the older people in our community would fit it into the historical context. It was such an interesting period. So yeah, we had a friend who left during this time, and I didn't say it because I didn't think it would be well received, but I thought, how could you leave at a time like this? This is so interesting. But like I say, perspective. So I had something to focus on, if you will.
You just gave me so many things that I want to ask you about now. I think the very first thing I really want to ask you about is how does this lockdown compare to other historical moments in Shanghai?
Well, obviously, it's unprecedented in many ways. But the first thing I went back to was wartime, Japanese occupation and wartime. This is nowhere near as extreme. We don't have a foreign occupying power. We don't have violence and cruelty. But I don't know if you've seen Empire of the Sun or read the book, but one of the iconic images in that film and the book is this young boy cycling around the empty streets of Shanghai, looking for food, going into, these mansions. Everybody's gone into an internment camp looking for food. What food can he find in the pantries? I have a friend who is 89 years old, and she is British, but she was born in Shanghai, and she still lives here. And she was in one of the internment camps. And she said that one of the similarities, one of the threads, is that during war, the hardest thing was the uncertainty. And she said that is the same today. So psychologically, that, not knowing when it's going to end, not knowing when the war was going to be over, it's very, very similar.
And they went through it for years.
4 years. Yes, exactly. They had 4 years.
Do you think that the experience has changed the perception of the Shanghainese government, for instance, and people here?
That's a really good question because I keep hearing people talk about how the Shanghainese government handled it. But I also hear people saying, well, that wasn't the Shanghainese government. They were taking instructions from a high authority. So I'll hear people in my building sort of saying, well, if Shanghai had been handling it, it would have been different. There's a lot of muttering in my building about, people from the north. So I think, again, it depends on perception. Are you conflating, the government with the Shanghai government versus, people be executing directions that they've been given? And we don't know. I mean, a lot of this is very opaque. But, the perception that I'm hearing from my neighbors is, right or wrong, is that, oh, this is not our Shanghai government.
Well, I also ask because a lot of Shanghainese, or especially the elderly ones, seem to be very opinionated on everything. So I figured you would have heard a lot of those stories and complaints from them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, they are very opinionated, and they really stand up for their rights. And I think part of that is, we have very opinionated couples in our building, in their mid to late 70s, and I sort of feel like they've been through some very chaotic periods in Shanghai's history, and they have absolutely no interest in going back to that. So, they're constantly reminding us, this is not the 1960s. This is not, don't forget, we're not going back.
Are we coming into a new era now? As in, since the opening, since Deng Xiaoping, every year has been kind of become better and more wealthy, just like you just said. People have built an appreciation for a time they don't want to go back to, harder time. Are we now getting into a different era?
That's really, really hard to say. My instinct is no, not economically. I mean, there may be, a blip here and there, but my gut says no. But I've also learned that predicting anything in China is so difficult. I just don't do it anymore. I've seen, like, throughout the lockdown, people saying, well, this is what's going to happen to trade, and this is what's going to happen to whatever. And I think, but we're not even out of it yet. So, and I'm thinking of 2020 when we were in January and February, right? And there was so much gloom and doom, and then boom, China came out, and who knows what this year will be like. We're also dealing with the unknown of this variant, right, of Omicron, as in it is new to everybody. It keeps mutating. We don't know what's gonna come. So there's a lot of you can't plan for something.
It's so interesting that you talk about memory, because I look at Wuhan 2020 and I compare how that's being memorialized here in China to how in Germany the fall of the Berlin Wall was memorialized, how that was differently memorialized, or 9/11 or other things. Do you have any thoughts on or expectations on how this is going to be memorialized or not?
Yeah, I mean, just based on what I've seen. So you've got I guess two levels of how things are memorialized in China. You've got the official level, and you've got what people remember. And I think on the official level, it will be remembered as a great victory. We will thank all the dabai. We will, thank all the selfless health workers, and we will congratulate each other for going through this, and justifiably, all of us for sort of, defeating this. On the personal level, I think, people will remember it in different ways. I always say that, I'm so glad you're doing these, by the way, because I always say, when people say, so what's it like? There are 26 million people in Shanghai and 26 million experiences. So everyone will remember it differently. But so there are people that will remember it very negatively. There are people that will remember not having food. There are people that will remember being hungry. But there are people that will also remember bonding with their neighbors, finally getting to know their neighbors. There are people that will remember, learning new skills. But I finally learned how to bake bread. So everyone's going to remember it differently.
What struck me a lot is the official memories, I don't want to use the word celebration, but chronicling of it doesn't seem to acknowledge the individual suffering of people who had these negative emotions
The
that we were
hardships,
talking about.
yeah.
And I wonder,
And I wonder if that will come later, perhaps, because in when you think about something like wartime, okay, wartime's easy because you can blame the outsiders, but you do acknowledge the hardship at some point. So there may be, it's too early, and maybe later on there will be an acknowledgement without placing blame on acknowledging that people had hardship. And, perhaps having hardship sort of makes the victory even sweeter,
More meaningful.
more meaningful, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall is meaningful because people had a longing to alleviate hardship at least.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And also, I guess also memory in China is such an interesting topic because so much is, what they want you to remember.
I'm very curious how that's going to go.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, also one memory that I have, and I think that other people on social media have, is living vicariously through your pictures on social media in the first few weeks. Because like you said, you were one of the first of us who was able to go out
Yes.
on Ulumuchilu here nearby. And usually you would take photos in places that we all know,
Right. Familiar
that we
places.
all take for granted going to. Tell me a little bit about what it was like on the first days to be out there. How did you feel?
Well, like I say, it felt a little bit like being in a new country. So it was very early in the morning, and when we found out that we could go out, and you were sort of literally almost creeping around, going, "Is this okay? Can we be outside?" And you say hello to anybody who was out there. Nothing was open, so it was more like waving to people on balconies and things like that. And it was strange because, for example, you'd see the avocado lady's doors closed. I mean, that's usually only closed on Chinese New Year for, 4 days, right? And that was strange. So it was just sort of seeing that whole stretch where, in some cases you've never ever seen the door. You don't know what the door of those buildings looks like. So seeing that silent and just, completely closed and silent. Not just, physically closed, but, the silence of all these places. But then very quickly also understanding how these whole, systems work, right? So avocado lady will sell you something, if you can find her. And if you find her, here you go. So, so that was also really interesting in a very sort of wartime kind of, sense. There's always deals to be made. There are people, there's a guy, our neighbors, will used to go out at 7 o'clock in the morning and they come back and say, okay, there's a guy in Ulaanbaatar who's got eggs, go now. There's a lady selling vegetables down the street, and then they disappeared 2 or 3 days later. So it was this kind of, it was a very, I don't know, like cowboy town kind of vibe. And I was interested because a lot of people, and perhaps, it was unique to that area because there were so many people who lived in that area that sold things. Because other people I know, would go out and say, oh, there's nothing to do. I'm going to go back in. I was like, are you kidding me? There's so much going on. You have to go out and monitor what's going on. Like who's selling what, where.
Exactly. And quite frankly, getting food probably became a lot more interesting than going to the same shop and just seeing if it's on the shelf.
Yeah.
You don't take things for granted.
Very much. And also, it gave you a sense of, again, what it must have been like during times of deprivation when, you don't turn your nose down at anything. I said to my husband after about our 12th cabbage, I said, I think maybe the reason that we don't eat cabbage is because we don't like it. I mean, why in 30 years of our marriage is this not a regular feature of our diet? But, you're like, okay, it's food. Just look up some cabbage recipes and figure it out. Whereas before you just feel like I'm just going to walk past the cabbage. I have choice. I'm going to have the broccoli instead. But in this case, it was, it was sort of learning to deal with what you have. And that's quite a big lesson because I feel like almost every society at some point in its history has had that kind of deprivation.
How did your and your husband's feeling during the lockdown evolve?
Feeling
The feelings like some people were at first reading it as a novelty and then growing more frustrated. Other people arranged themselves and became more content during the lockdown. Was it for you always the same, or did you guys?
It was. I mean, I think if anything, it was sort of so like you were absolutely right. The first week, 10 days, was a novelty. I mean, you're trying to figure out how to live with this, right? And so many uncertainties, like you don't know when the deliveries are coming. Are they coming at all? Because at first, that was not clear, right? Are we getting any more food? Are we going to have to live with this? How are we going to make all this last for nobody knows how long? But once things got going, well, of course, once we got out, it became very different, and it sort of did settle into routine. So, in terms of changing, actually, I think for us it was more positive. I mean, it was never negative, but it was different because once we could get out, that was a whole different thing. You could go out, look for food. You could actually also like take things to friends. You could, order group buys and like share it amongst people. So there was a lot more that could be done. And often I said, it felt like between foraging for food, foraging for information, which was a whole nother thing, right? Trying to get news, cooking and cleaning. I mean, there was no time to be doing anything else, worrying or planning. No, there's just no time. It was a subsistence is too strong a word, but it was almost like that kind of living. Like from morning till night, you've got so much stuff to do.
I think you just mentioned information and communication, both between people and also the official communication. It's definitely a topic that people have a lot of opinions on now.
Yes.
How do you feel about it?
It was very, very interesting to watch. I mean, the official communication seemed to either be so sort of vague as to be like ineffective, as in, you'd have to wait for the interpretation, or it confirmed something that had been rumored about, for a while. So, really quite often you were just constantly checking your WeChat to see, what's the latest rumor, what's going on. And, again, much of what's really difficult to explain to people who are not in Shanghai about this lockdown is how in a communist country there may be one message, but the way that message gets interpreted actually can go down to like the cell level, to the building level. So you have a message that says, if you're in a precautionary zone, you may leave. But whoever's running that building gets to say, no, you can't. They actually get to, go against that larger message. So that's been really interesting because, people who either used to live here or, know other people in Shanghai will say, well, how is it you can go out and other people can't? And you have to say, well, it's because the rules are interpreted differently.
I think ambiguity actually has also a historical background here in its communication, right?
Yeah, deliberately so, right? Deliberate ambiguity, yeah.
How so? Can you give me an example?
Well, again, I think that, for example, the lists of the dividing the areas, right, into the precautionary, et cetera, zone. I believe the original data was like if you have no cases for 14 days, right? Which is fairly clear. But somehow when that would get interpreted, it was, 14 days from when? And if you have another one, that just becomes a rolling lockdown. So, in this case, this is ambiguous. They're not saying 14 days, then you're out. If you have, this many, it just keeps going. Well, what happens in that case? Well, that's not addressed.
Also, 14 days where, right? Just my building, my floor, my...
Yeah. So a lot of it is not addressed. And also, in the compound, not in the compound. Inside your door, in the corridor,
Did you see people having to go to quarantine?
No, we had nobody in our building. I heard that somebody next door did, and I never saw anybody. I mean, somebody else did, but I never saw um, anyone go to quarantine.
When you talk to people who are not in China, how do you describe this lockdown?
Well, I think most people I know have been through some type of lockdown. Uh, Singapore had a fairly strict one. In the U.S., I think a lot of people lived in some type of lockdown. So it's so I describe that, and then plus, because you actually can't go out. There's actually nothing open, and this is also not just describing it to people outside of China, but describing it to people who were in China in 2020 and are not here now, because it's a very different lockdown. In 2020, the shops were open. You could order food. You could have friends over. We were never. Our building was never locked down in 2020. So, sort of even explaining that to people who were here, who say, "Oh, well, I've been through a China lockdown." That's piece of cake, right? And think, this one's a little bit different.
You said something very interesting to me earlier in that you heard people wanted to leave and you thought, how could they? Has this experience changed your feelings towards being here at all, or are you exactly the same person as you were before the lockdown?
No, I think that because of my experience, I haven't changed enormously. I think had my experience been different, had I gone into quarantine, had I been locked in a place that didn't have sunshine and a balcony, had I been locked in for 2 months straight without being able to go, had I been locked in without food, I would no doubt think of it very differently. I think that having had this soft lockdown experience, I have the luxury of being able to look at it intellectually and in a historical context, and not feel that it damaged me in any way, and to kind of say only happened just, how could you leave at such an interesting time? But like I say, I don't want to diminish the fact that so many people had very different experiences, and and again, like, our children are grown up. If I had little kids who needed to be outside, that would be a very different experience. I've had friends who left because they said, I don't want my kids to be going to school online indefinitely, and that is completely justifiable. I feel like I would have made that choice as well. But for me, for right now, no. Let's see what happens with the next lockdown, though. Everything is unpredictable in China.
I agree with that, but I wanna hear one prediction from you, and it's during the COVID lockdown, basically since early 2020, the number of foreigners living in Shanghai and partially at least shaping the city has gone down quite dramatically, and it's going down again. Do you see this number rebounding after the border restrictions end, or do you think this is a new normal?
I think it will really depend very much on what the regulations are. So if, border restrictions are and people are able to travel, I think you'll get some people back. I think some people will still be concerned that, something like this could happen again, because I think this is the complaint, right? That it's unpredictable. You have no choice. You can't even get to the airport. You can't even leave, right, in a situation like this. So that may be. But I think that regardless of whether foreigners are here or not, the city is a cosmopolitan city. It's in its DNA. There were 40, 50 years when there were no foreigners in Shanghai. It remained a cosmopolitan city. And I think that its people remain cosmopolitan. And I think that it's partly the physical city. It's partly the fact that they've grown up knowing that they come from this international city. It's partly language, but I think that, there may be times in history when there are fewer foreigners, no foreigners, but it's not going to change Shanghai as much as people think it might.
Well, I'm very thankful that we're able to go outside again and that we got to have this conversation.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Great questions.
Thank you so much.